He testified she'd been the one cheating, until she played the secret voicemail he'd left his mistress. He stood at the witness stand and swore under oath that his wife had been unfaithful. What he didn't know was that his own voice was already loaded into the courtroom's audio system, waiting. The Hargrove County Family Court smelled like old carpet and recycled air, the kind of municipal building that has absorbed so many broken marriages that the walls themselves seemed to exhale quiet misery. It was a Tuesday in November, overcast, the light through the high narrow windows gray and flat. The hallways were the particular beige of institutional indifference, scuffed at the baseboards, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed just below the threshold of conscious awareness. But inside courtroom 4, the air had changed. It had the density of something about to happen. The gallery benches were half full, lawyers shuffling papers, a court reporter with her fingers poised like a pianist, waiting for the first note, a young paralegal in the second row who kept glancing at the audio equipment near the wall, as if trying to remember whether it had always been there. 3 rows back, mostly invisible, a woman named Miriam Solis sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not move. She had not moved in quite some time. People who passed her in the hallway that morning noticed the stillness of her, not the stillness of someone defeated, but the stillness of someone who has already decided. Her posture was composed. Her expression was neutral. Her eyes, when they moved at all, moved with the deliberate calm of someone who knows exactly what is coming and has made her peace with it. Her soon-to-be ex-husband, Daniel Solis, sat at the opposing table with the kind of posture that expensive suits make possible. He was 44, dark-haired, with the particular handsomeness of a man who has been told he is handsome often enough that it has become a feature of his self-concept rather than simply his face. He had been, for most of their 11-year marriage, a man who moved through rooms like he owned them. He had, over those 11 years, arranged it so that he increasingly did. The restaurant group had started as 2 locations and was now 7, anchored by a flagship downtown that Daniel referenced in conversation with the frequency of a man who needs people around him to know what he has built. There was the real estate portfolio, assembled quietly through a series of LLCs and holding companies that appeared in their joint financial disclosure as a kind of blur, present but not quite legible, numbers without clear ownership structures attached. There was the consulting arrangement that had paid a significant sum into an account Miriam had not been named on. There was the LLC that existed mostly as a rumor in the financial paperwork, and fully as a reality in a separate filing that Miriam's attorney, a careful woman named Patricia Voss, had located 11 weeks ago after 3 months of very patient looking. Daniel's attorney, a man named Elliot Burke, who had been recommended to him by his golf partner and his girlfriend's father in the same conversation, sat beside him with a yellow legal pad and an expression of preemptive satisfaction. Burke was 60, florid, and had the confidence of a man who has won enough cases to mistake his record for a guarantee. The proceedings had begun 3 days earlier. What had been, for Daniel, a relatively simple plan. Establish Miriam as the unstable, adulterous partner, draw the court's attention away from the financial irregularities, walk away with the business interests intact and the settlement minimized, had seemed to him airtight. He had, after all, prepared for this. He had a witness. He had documentation, or something that resembled it closely enough in the dim light of a courtroom where the other side didn't know what was coming. He had the confidence of a man who has never lost a negotiation, because he has always been in the room with people who needed him more than he needed them. Vendors, suppliers, junior partners, a wife who for 11 years had absorbed his version of reality because he had constructed it so thoroughly around her that she had nothing else to stand on. He did not fully understand what kind of room he was in now. The first 2 days had gone as he expected. Burke had introduced testimony about Miriam's mental health history, a period of anxiety following the miscarriage 4 years ago that had required medication and several months of therapy. which Burke framed with the clinical detachment of a man describing a plumbing problem, presenting her grief and her treatment as evidence of instability rather than evidence of being human. He had introduced screenshots from Miriam's phone, text messages to a male friend that had been stripped of their surrounding context and arranged to suggest an intimacy that existed only in the arrangement. He had introduced the testimony of a former colleague of Miriam's named Gerald Fitch, a thin man in an ill-fitting blazer who described seeing her embrace a male friend at a work function in 2021 with what he characterized as notable intimacy, pausing on the word notable in a way that was clearly rehearsed. The judge, a 60-year-old woman named the Honorable Constance Wyeth, had listened to all of this with her reading glasses balanced at the end of her nose, and the particular neutrality of someone who has heard worse and will hear worse again, and has long since stopped letting worse surprise her. Miriam had sat through all of it without expression. That night, in the parking garage of her attorney's building, Patricia Voss had looked at her client across the roof of a silver Honda and said very quietly, "Tomorrow is when we go." The garage was cold and smelled of exhaust and wet concrete. Their breath made small clouds in the air. Miriam had nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when a plan they have been carrying for months is finally close enough to touch. She had been waiting for tomorrow for 9 months. She was very good at waiting. It had begun, as many things do, with a sound she wasn't supposed to hear. A voicemail left in error on the home landline. A number Daniel had apparently forgotten still existed, a relic of an earlier era that Miriam had arranged to forward automatically to her cell without ever mentioning it. He had been drunk, or nearly, calling from what she later learned was a hotel bar 40 minutes from their home on an evening when he had told her he was at a dinner for a potential investor. His voice had that particular loosening that happens when someone believes they are entirely alone with their own words. The softening of consonants, the sentence that begin to wander, because there is no one watching them that the speaker respects. He had called the woman, a woman named Cassandra Webb, who worked in the marketing division of his restaurant group, and who had, Miriam would later learn, been with Daniel for the better part of 2 years. And he had spoken for 4 minutes and 22 seconds in a way that would have been merely damning if he had limited himself to declarations of affection. He had not limited himself. He had also, in the rambling, self-satisfied way of a man who feels entirely safe, described certain arrangements he had made. Financial arrangements, the LLC, the accounts in the holding company's name, the way the restaurant group had been restructured deliberately, with the help of an accommodating accountant named Fielding, to minimize what a divorce settlement might reach. He said the word Miriam twice, both times with a contempt that had a texture. Not hot contempt, not angry contempt, but the cold administrative contempt of someone who has been planning something for longer than the other person knows and has already begun to think of them in the past tense. Miriam had listened to that voicemail 17 times. Not from the desire to hurt herself with it, though it did hurt, in the way that confirmation of something you already sensed but refused to fully believe always hurts. A kind of retroactive grief for a marriage she now understood had been a different thing for each of them. She listened 17 times because she was listening for specifics, names, numbers, structures, the word Fielding, the phrase the holding entity, the casual, unguarded mention of an account in the Cayman Islands that he tossed out as if it were a minor detail. Then she had called Patricia Voss. That had been 9 months ago. 9 months of building, quietly, methodically, in the direction that his own voice had inadvertently pointed her. Patricia had retained a forensic accountant named David Chu within the first 2 weeks. Chu's firm specialized in exactly the kind of layered restructuring that Daniel had employed. The use of LLCs as shells, the movement of revenue through consulting arrangements that existed primarily as mechanisms for reclassifying income, the technique of using a business reorganization to reduce the apparent value of marital assets in ways that looked legitimate on the surface and required considerable patience to disentangle. Chu had begun with the LLC named in the voicemail and pulled threads from there, and what he found was not a single thread, but a web. Each entity connected to another, assets shifting between them in a pattern that was, as Chu would later describe to Patricia, not the product of ordinary business complexity, but the product of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time. She had retained an investigator named Renata Bliss, whose specialty was establishing the timeline of an extramarital relationship with documented precision, specifically for establishing that the relationship had existed and been actively concealed during the same period. Certain financial decisions had been made, which bore directly on questions of marital waste and fiduciary breach. Bliss had been careful and thorough and delivered her timeline in a binder 73 pages long, cross-referenced to the financial documents at 17 separate points. And Patricia had kept a copy of the voicemail in 3 separate locations, 2 cloud backups, and 1 physical drive in a locked cabinet. And she had said nothing about it to anyone outside her immediate team, and she had waited for Elliot Burke to make the move she knew he would make, because men like Daniel retain attorneys who think like Daniel, which is to say attorneys who cannot resist the satisfaction of the first strike. Burke had made his move on day 2, just as Patricia had anticipated. He had put Daniel on the stand that afternoon, and Daniel had testified with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed this particular scene many times, in the mirror and with Burke, and probably alone in hotel rooms, while Miriam sat at home not knowing what was being built against her. He had described a specific incident, a name, a date, a hotel on the east side of the city, a colleague of Miriam's he claimed to have seen her with on a Saturday afternoon when she had told him she was visiting her sister. His voice was measured and sorrowful in a performed way, calibrated to project reluctance, the voice of a man who does not want to say these things and is saying them only because the truth demands it. Burke had nodded along at each detail, as if hearing this for the first time. The gallery was quiet. Judge Wyeth had made a note, her pen moving once across her legal pad without looking up. Miriam had not moved. Now it was Wednesday morning, and Patricia Voss rose from her chair with the unhurried quality of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. She was 53, angular, with close-cropped dark hair, and the habit of pausing before she spoke in a way that made the room lean in toward her. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to recall Mr. Solis to the stand." Daniel settled into the witness chair with the ease of a man who had already survived cross-examination once and expected this to be more of the same. More questions about his business interests, more careful deflection, more opportunities to present himself as the wronged party who had simply made sensible financial arrangements. He smoothed his jacket. He settled his hands on the railing. He looked at Patricia with the specific expression of a man who believes he is managing the situation. A slight lift of the chin, a willingness bordering on welcome, the performance of someone with nothing to hide. "Mr. Solis," Patricia said, "you testified yesterday that your wife was engaged in an extramarital relationship." "That's correct." "And during that same period, you were aware of no such relationship on your own part." "I was not." Patricia let that sit in the air for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "I'd like to introduce Exhibit 14. She nodded toward her associate, a young man named Marcus, who stood near the audio equipment that had, without comment or particular ceremony, been set up that morning before the gallery filled. No one had objected to it. Burke had glanced at it twice during the morning's preliminary proceedings and each time appeared to reach the conclusion that it was probably a transcript display setup or evidence playback for documents he had already accounted for. He had not asked. "This is a voicemail recording retrieved from the Solis residence landline, dated March 7th of last year. I'll ask the court's indulgence." Daniel Solis's face, in the 3 seconds between Patricia's introduction of the exhibit and the beginning of the recording, completed a journey. It was a short journey, but a visible one. Something flickered across it. A calculation, an uncertainty. The specific micro-expression of a man who has just received information that doesn't fit the model he has been operating from and is trying very quickly to figure out what it means. There was a fraction of a second that looked almost like recognition. Then, the sound of his own voice filled the courtroom. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 22 seconds. During those 4 minutes and 22 seconds, the court reporter's fingers stilled completely over her keys for the first time all morning. Judge Wyeth removed her reading glasses and set them down on the bench in front of her, with a quietness that was itself a statement. In the gallery, 2 people shifted in their seats. A third stopped pretending to look at her phone. Elliot Burke had gone very still in his chair in the particular way of a man trying to calculate damage, while simultaneously maintaining the expression of someone to whom nothing unexpected is happening. Daniel had half risen from the witness chair, involuntarily, in the second minute of the recording. A physical response to hearing his own voice say things he had believed no one else would ever hear. Before he caught himself and lowered back down, with the slow, careful movement of someone trying not to draw attention to the fact that they just tried to stand up for no reason in the middle of a courtroom during a recorded exhibit. His voice on the recording spoke with the looseness of a man alone. It mentioned Cassandra by name. It mentioned the LLC. It mentioned the accountant Fielding with the offhand familiarity of a co-conspirator. It described the restructuring in terms that were, when heard in a courtroom context rather than a hotel bar context, several degrees more incriminating than Daniel had apparently understood at the time. And it said the word Miriam twice, in the tone that had a texture. When it ended, the room held its silence for a moment before the ambient sounds of the building returned. The distant click of a door somewhere, the hum of the ventilation system, the slight shift of bodies in wooden gallery benches. "Mr. Solis," Patricia said, "is that your voice?" A long pause. His jaw moved slightly before the word came out. Yes. And in that recording, you reference a Cassandra Webb by name." Another pause, shorter this time. The pause of a man shifting strategies mid-sentence. "Yes." "You reference her in the context of a relationship that you told this court yesterday did not exist." Burke was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is characterizing—" "I'll rephrase," Patricia said, without looking at Burke. "Mr. Solis, how long had your relationship with Cassandra Webb been ongoing as of March 7th of last year?" The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely. Daniel looked at Burke. Burke's expression communicated nothing useful. Daniel looked back at Patricia. He said nothing. "The court will note the witness's non-response," Judge Wyeth said, in a tone that contained the specific flatness of someone who has seen this exact moment many times. "You may proceed, Ms. Voss." "Your Honor," Patricia said, "I'd like to call David Chu to the stand." David Chu was 51, compact and deliberate, and moved with the specific efficiency of a man who has testified in court many times and finds it neither frightening nor particularly interesting. Simply a thing that one does carefully, as one would calibrate any instrument before use. He took the oath with the unhurried matter-of-factness of someone for whom oaths are routine, settled into the witness chair, and waited with his hands folded and his posture exactly straight. He had brought documents. Exhibits. 15 through 23 were introduced over the following 30 minutes, and what they described, in the precise technical language of forensic accounting, the language of someone who understands money as a system of flows and can read a deliberate obstruction, the way a cardiologist reads an irregular scan, was the architecture of a structure assembled over 4 years with considerable care. It was built around a central LLC registered in Delaware, which served as the nominal owner of 2 of the restaurant group's most valuable locations. That LLC was itself wholly owned by a holding company registered under a name that bore no obvious relationship to the Solis Restaurant Group. The holding company had received, over 38 months, approximately $2.3 million in transfers from the restaurant group's operating accounts. Transfers that appeared in the books as management fees, consulting arrangements, and a licensing agreement for proprietary recipes that, upon examination, turned out to be recipes developed by the restaurant group's own kitchen staff and not, in any legally defensible sense, the intellectual property of the entity charging for them. The accountant Fielding, whose name appeared in the voicemail and whose firm's letterhead appeared on several documents Chu now walked through, had signed off on each arrangement with the compliance of someone who understood what the client needed the numbers to say. Burke objected 6 times over the course of Chu's testimony. Judge Wyeth overruled him 5 times and sustained him once on a narrow procedural ground that changed nothing about the substance of what Chu had described and what was now entered into the record. Burke's cross-examination of Chu lasted 20 minutes. Chu answered each question with the same measured precision he had brought to Patricia's questions. And when Burke pushed on the interpretation of certain transfers, Chu acknowledged the alternative interpretations he was aware of, explained exactly why each of them was inconsistent with the documentary evidence, and returned to his original conclusion without apparent distress. Burke sat down with less momentum than he had stood with. Then Renata Bliss took the stand. She was 58, with short silver hair and the kind of professional affect that radiates not warmth but reliability. The sense that what she tells you is what she found, unembellished, and that she found it carefully. She had spent 7 months establishing the timeline of the relationship between Daniel Solis and Cassandra Webb. She had its beginning, a hotel in the city's arts district, 14 months before the recording, documented by phone records and a room charge on a business credit card. She had its development, a pattern of communication visible in metadata, even when the messages themselves had been deleted, calls from secondary numbers, a geography of movements that tells a story when plotted across enough time. She had the dates of the restaurant group's restructuring. She had the overlap. She had the sequence. First the relationship, then Fielding, then the restructuring, laid out with the clarity of someone who has studied this itinerary many times and can now recite it in their sleep. She spoke for 45 minutes and answered Patricia's questions with precision that assembled something in the courtroom with the quality of inevitability, not because truth is always inevitable, but because this truth had been documented so thoroughly from so many independent angles that the only word for what sat before the court now was case. Burke attempted a cross-examination. He challenged Bliss's methodology on 2 points. She acknowledged both, explained her approach in greater detail, and demonstrated that neither challenge altered her conclusions. He challenged the admissibility of phone metadata, which Judge Wyeth had already ruled on in a pre-trial motion. She had not forgotten. Burke sat down. Then Patricia said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Cassandra Webb." This had not been on the witness list that Burke had received at the start of proceedings. He rose from his chair and began an objection. His voice had the quality of a man trying to sound controlled, while understanding, somewhere beneath the control, that the situation has changed significantly since he last checked. But Cassandra Webb was already in the room. She had been in the building for 45 minutes, in a small conference room on the 2nd floor, accompanied by her attorney, a woman named Joanna Hale, who had advised her client in terms that were direct and clear and left very little room for misunderstanding about what cooperation and non-cooperation would each mean for Cassandra going forward. Cassandra walked to the witness stand in a forest green coat and low heels, and she had the look of someone who has recently made a decision that is still settling in the body. A controlled face over something less controlled. A composure that was real, but had been assembled recently and with some effort. She had been, until 6 weeks ago, under the impression that she was building a future with Daniel Solis. He had told her, over the course of 2 years, that the marriage was functionally over, that he and Miriam had reached an understanding, that it was a matter of paperwork and time, that he was handling it carefully because of the business interests involved, and he needed her to be patient, which she had been, because she had believed him. She was no longer under that impression. She had stopped being under that impression on a specific evening 6 weeks ago when her attorney had shown her a set of documents. Documents pertaining to the restaurant group's ownership structure, specifically to a partnership arrangement that Daniel had described to Cassandra in considerable detail and with considerable enthusiasm as her future stake in the business, a stake that her attorney had then explained to her, with the delicacy of someone delivering news that will hurt, did not exist in any form that Daniel had the legal authority to create. He had been promising her shares in a structure he had built specifically to shelter from any outside claim. He had been promising her, in effect, nothing, and she had loved him through it. She took the oath. She sat. She looked at Patricia Voss and waited. She confirmed the beginning date of the relationship, which matched Renata Bliss's documentation to the week. She confirmed that Daniel had represented to her, consistently and over many months, that Miriam was aware the marriage was over. She confirmed that he had asked her on multiple occasions not to discuss their relationship with anyone outside a very small circle, which she had at the time understood as discretion and now understood differently. She confirmed the conversations about the business structure, the promises, the partnership language he had used, the specific assurances about what she would receive when things were formalized. And then, in response to a question from Patricia about whether Daniel had ever spoken to her about the divorce proceedings directly, she said yes. She said that approximately 4 months ago, during a dinner at a restaurant that was not one of his own, Daniel had told her that the proceedings were going exactly as planned, that his attorney was very good, and that the financial picture would be, in his words, completely clean by the time a judge saw it. Completely clean. The gallery did not make a sound. Burke's cross-examination of Cassandra Webb lasted 11 minutes. He attempted to establish that she had reason to be hostile to Daniel, which she acknowledged, without visible emotion, was accurate, and which she noted did not make anything she had testified to less true. He attempted to challenge her recollection of the dinner conversation. She gave him the date, the restaurant's name, the dish she had ordered, and the specific table they had sat at, which was near the window on the south wall. He did not push further on that point. He sat down. Judge Wyeth called a recess. 15 minutes, she said. It lasted 12. When she returned and took her seat, there was a quality to her settling into the chair, a deliberateness, a gathering, that made the room quiet before she said a word. She removed her reading glasses. She placed them precisely on the bench in front of her. She looked at Daniel Solis for a moment with the expression of someone who is taking a final measurement and has already done the arithmetic. "Mr. Solis," Judge Wyeth said, "I want to be direct with you, and I want the record to reflect exactly what I am about to say." Her voice was even and unhurried, the voice of someone who does not need volume to carry authority. "You came before this court and offered testimony under oath that constructed a narrative of spousal infidelity. I am satisfied, on the basis of the evidence presented today, that this narrative was fabricated, not mistaken, not exaggerated, but deliberately and purposefully fabricated, as a strategy to redirect this court's attention from conduct that I find far more consequential. The deliberate structured concealment of marital assets, the systematic movement of jointly owned business value into entities designed to place it beyond the reach of an equitable division, and the use of this courtroom as the venue to advance that concealment through false testimony." She paused. In the gallery, no one moved. "You swore an oath in this room and said things this record has now substantially contradicted, in your own voice with your own words, from an exhibit you apparently did not know existed. I take that very seriously. I expect that the appropriate bodies will take it seriously as well, and I am directing the clerk to preserve the full record of these proceedings accordingly." She looked briefly at Elliot Burke, who was studying his legal pad with the focus of a man who has decided that eye contact is currently inadvisable. With respect to the financial matters, the court is ordering a full and independent forensic review of every entity identified in Exhibits 15 through 23 and any connected entities that review identifies. The costs of that review will be borne by the respondent. I am making a preliminary finding of dissipation of marital assets and a breach of fiduciary duty to the marital estate. The division of assets in this matter will proceed on the basis of full valuation, inclusive of the transferred assets, and I am granting Ms. Voss's motion for a temporary restraining order on all transfers from the identified entities pending completion of the review. Mr. Burke, you will have 14 days to respond in writing to these preliminary findings, and I would strongly encourage you to review the complete evidentiary record with care before determining what position you intend to take. She picked up her glasses. We'll reconvene Thursday at 9. Court is in recess. The gavel landed once, clean and final. Daniel Solis sat for a moment in the witness chair as if he had not fully processed the instruction to leave it. Burke leaned toward him and said something in a low voice. Daniel stood slowly, adjusted his jacket with a movement that was purely automatic, and walked back to the respondent's table without looking up. The posture that expensive suits make possible had, somewhere in the last hour, stopped working. Miriam Solis stood, gathered her coat from the back of her chair, smoothed it once, and walked out of the courtroom. She did not look at Daniel. She had not looked at him once all day. Not from avoidance, not from anger, but from the simple fact that she no longer needed anything from him. Not confirmation, not reaction, not the particular satisfaction of watching someone understand what has happened to them. She was done needing things from him. That was its own kind of verdict. In the marble corridor outside courtroom 4, the November light came in pale and clean through the tall windows at the end of the hall, washing the floor in a long rectangle of white. The building sounds reached her, voices from other floors, the distant percussion of a closing door, the mechanical sigh of the elevator. And all of it seemed very ordinary, which was strange, given that the last few hours had been the opposite of ordinary. She stood in the white rectangle of light and breathed, one breath and then another. Patricia Voss came through the courtroom doors a moment later and came to stand beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. The hallway went on being the hallway. The light went on being the light. There was nothing that needed to be said, because everything that needed to be said had already been said, in a courtroom, into a record that would not be amended by people who had spent 9 months making sure of it. Then Miriam put on her coat. Patricia picked up her briefcase, and together they walked toward the elevator, and behind them, the heavy courtroom doors swung shut on everything that had been left inside. The documents, the testimony, the 4 minutes and 22 seconds of a man's voice saying things he thought no one would ever hear. And none of it followed her out into the light. Here's what this story asks you to remember. A lie is not a plan. It is a liability. Every false word Daniel Solis spoke in that courtroom, every layer of misdirection he had constructed over 4 years of marriage, every structure he had built to shelter himself from the consequences of his own choices, all of it became a structural weakness the moment someone with the patience to look began looking. He built a fortress out of deception, and the thing about fortresses built from deception is that every wall is secretly a door. You just need someone methodical enough to find it, and patient enough to wait for the right moment to walk through. Miriam didn't fight loud. She didn't fight angry. She didn't fire off accusations in the middle of the night or make scenes that could be used against her. She listened to a 4-minute, 22-second voicemail on a Thursday evening, and she understood, in that quiet kitchen with her phone against her ear, that the weapon she needed was already in her hands. She spent 9 months turning it into something a courtroom could hold. That is not revenge. That is architecture. If this story moved you, if you believe, as Miriam proved, that preparation beats confidence and patience, beats performance every single time. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because the next story is already waiting, and it is even more satisfying than this one.